This one's a classic.
Welcome back to our exploration of the forgotten areas of MapleStory. In this series, we take a look at some of the locations throughout the game's history that have been removed or simply forgotten. The places you traveled through in order to reach your actual destination. Places you might either remember vaguely or might have completely forgotten. These locations all have their own stories that I find very fascinating, so let's talk a bit about them. I've said it many times before on my channel. Exploration in these MMOs was always my favorite part of the game. I loved learning about the world and seeing what it had to offer. A while back, I came across a game called Eidolon that has a very interesting world of its own to discover. The mix of idle game and MMO fascinated me, so when they offered me a sponsorship deal, I accepted. I've been playing both idle games and MMOs for years. A game that combined the best aspects of the two sounds perfect. Eidolon lets me make forward progress on my account even when I'm not actively playing, and it has secrets of its own to discover. Arguably, my favorite area that I've found since I started playing is the Oasis, which contains this thing. I'm a busy person these days. I can't play games as much as I used to. As much as I want to spend all day hanging out with Poppy the kangaroo mouse, I can't do that. Eidolon doesn't demand nearly as much of my time as other MMOs, and that's very valuable to me these days. Since it's available on both iOS and Steam, I can hop in-game on my phone and head to the Oasis, the best area in the game, to check up on my fish pond progression and hang out with Poppy the kangaroo mouse. And whenever I'm at my computer, I can just launch the game through Steam, and my account is seamlessly saved to the cloud, which is super convenient. You can play Eidolon for free on Steam using the links posted in the description and the pinned comment. Thanks again to Eidolon for sponsoring this video. One of the most iconic locations that I'm sure most people will remember is the legendary Slime Tree map located south of Illenia. While this is the name that most people remember it by, Slime Tree is actually a colloquialism. The real name of this map is Dungeon Southern Forest 1, which is almost as catchy. This is one of about 15 other maps located throughout Illenia that are classified as tree dungeons. These maps contain everything from slimes on the lower end up to zombie lupins on the high end, and they're located throughout the entirety of Illenia. Back in the day, especially during the pre-Osiria beta period of the game, these maps were widely used by a variety of classes as somewhat niche training spots. Slime Tree itself is a huge map. It's very tall, and because of that, it could be shared easily, which players often found themselves doing whether they wanted to or not. It was a great KSing spot for sure, but in my experience, KSing wasn't that common in Slime Tree. This was mostly just a location for low-level first-job players who wanted an easy grind until they were able to move on to the monsters who hit harder. Just like some of the other early first-job training maps such as Hinnis' Hunting Ground, this map was accessible to everyone. Ranged classes had enough room to work with here that their minimum range requirement wasn't usually an issue, and melee classes were able to traverse through the map quickly enough that they were able to get good EXP rates as well. The balance of this map is impressive, but it's not that surprising, since we're talking about a map that was in the game since the very early days. Design philosophies were different back then. The track that plays here, called Missing You, is also incredibly iconic, something everyone will likely remember. It's a very relaxing piano melody underscored by the usual various ambient, slightly ethereal instruments that we find on every Illenia track. The bass is subtle and ties it all together in a very pleasing way. It's an incredible song. Slime Tree is one of the most well-remembered maps in old-school MapleStory. Very few could compete with its legacy, since everyone who played the game for basically any amount of time probably found themselves training here. The thing about Slime Tree is because it was so accessible from such an early level, A huge number of players grinded here at one point or another, and developed memories of it because of that. I wish I had some interesting stories of my own to share about this map, but I've spent so much time here on so many characters, it's kind of become a blur. I think it's about time I discussed what is probably the biggest, most well-known map in all of old school MapleStory. I put it off for a while, simply because everyone talks about Hinnis' hunting ground. It's the first thing you find in those extremely uninspired "Why MapleStory is bad now" videos that were super popular for a while. Hinnis' hunting ground is so well known that knowledge of it could be considered surface-level knowledge of old-school MapleStory, and I personally feel like there are plenty of other areas worth discovering. But with the legacy that Hinnis' hunting ground left behind being such an impactful area for so many people, I feel as though it's my duty to discuss it. So, let's talk about it. There's a lot to cover with Hinnis' hunting ground, and it has a similar story as Slime Tree actually. A well-designed layout that was accessible to all types of players, though I would argue it leaned a bit more in favor of ranged attackers with its multiple sniping platforms that were located throughout. The thing is, Hinnis' hunting ground isn't just one map, it's actually 3 different maps. Hinnis' Hunting Ground 2 and 3 both feature the same monsters as Hinnis' Hunting Ground 1, but with the addition of stump enemies. These 2 maps were both less popular than Hinnis' Hunting Ground 1, which was good because their layouts were effectively the same, and this allowed players to grind here with less competition. These maps were accessed via ropes, with Hinnis' Hunting Ground 2 having an extra rope at the top that led to the map Meet the Parents. This map was added in version 33 as part of an event. You can learn more about that in my old school MapleStory update history video. Hinnis' Hunting Ground 1 is where all of the memories were made though, even beyond the training and the leveling. Something we'd often find in Hinnis' Hunting Ground 1 were people just hanging out, having public conversations on top of the little hut at the bottom right of the map. Trades would happen here, friends would be met, Hinny-hos would hang on during the extremely rare occasions where they would enter a map that actually had monsters in it. We often saw high-level players showing off their skills here too. After the release of 4th Job, these players would wow the noobs of Hinnis' hunting ground by casting Blizzard and killing half the monsters on the map. It was cool, but also very annoying. Channel 1 of Hinnis' hunting ground would almost always be full, and it was difficult to actually train there, but outside of that packed first channel, training here was really good EXP for early 1st Job characters. There were a variety of monsters, from snails to green mushrooms, so it was a good training spot all the way until level 20 or so, depending on what class the player actually was. As a poor, low-level warrior, I remember grinding here in my early 20s just to make some mesos so I can go to higher-level areas. I think I was able to make about 20,000 mesos an hour grinding here, which just sounds like nothing nowadays. Since Hinnis' hunting ground was just outside of Hinnis, players accidentally found themselves here often, which definitely contributed to its popularity. Even if you didn't know what you were doing at all, it was easy to wander into Hinnis' hunting ground and begin training. These are enemies that players would recognize from Maple Island, with the upper levels holding slightly stronger monsters, so it was an easy connection to make. These are monsters I know I can kill. Let's try out my new 1st Job skills on them. And that's the legacy of Hinnis' hunting ground. Located within the Sharenian ruins, far outside of Parion and beyond the excavation site, is a series of maps containing undead skeleton enemies. During a small period of time, during the era between version 34 and around version 44, these maps were meta. Voodoos weren't available yet, and though Mu Lung was released in version 41, straw target dummies didn't scale very well beyond level 60 or so. These skeleton soldiers had the best EXP available to late 2nd Job classes during this short period of time. None of the maps were too amazing in terms of layout, but back in these super early days of GMS, they were still considered favorable training spots. Players were more hardened and accustomed to grinding at areas like Deep Ludi and El Nath, so this kind of layout was the standard back then. Assassins, clerics, and archers were great at training here. Even warriors could get decent EXP rates at these soldier maps, though melee classes were usually better off at Forest of Golem around these levels. Both of the enemies that people actually grinded on in the camp maps were undead, so they were susceptible to heal damage, and this would be a natural stepping stone after zombie lupins started to overstay their welcome. If a cleric preferred training on skeleton enemies over zombies in El Nath, it was due to their drop table difference primarily. Between the skeleton soldiers and the officer skeletons, it was possible to acquire Glove for Attack 60% scrolls, Claw for Attack 60% scrolls, and 60% magic attack scrolls for both staves and wands, on top of the already amazing EXP rates. This was back when these scrolls still had significant value, and a lot of Glove for Attack 60% scrolls were generated from players killing these monsters. The officer skeleton enemies could also drop the Blood Gigantic, which was pretty good, but it could have been even better if it wasn't for the fact that it gave Dex, which was practically worthless on a claw. So while their drop table wasn't insane, this was a good deal better than what zombies offered in terms of drops. Weirdly, these maps are mostly unchanged in modern MapleStory. The monsters have been rearranged, but the maps still cover the same level range and everything, though I'm not sure it's all that popular of a training spot these days, with people blazing through these levels so quickly. For a time, it found its presence back in the meta for leveling link mules, but it's definitely on its way out once more if it hasn't already been forgotten again. How could we discuss the forgotten areas of MapleStory without covering one of the most beloved locations? Florina Beach has been around since the beta period of GMS and has its fair share of interesting areas, though within recent years it's been locked off and has yet to return. One of the most interesting things about Florina Beach is actually traveling there. The normal route to Florina Beach involved talking to Payson in Lith Harbor, Shuri in Orbis, or Nara in Ludibrium to travel there for a small fee, but paying this fee wasn't necessarily required. There was a quest line that began in Omega Sector and eventually rewarded an item called the VIP ticket to Florina Beach. This item could be used to waive all fees to Florina Beach forever, as long as the item was in the player's possession. This is a weird, legendary item that I always assumed was just never made available to us in GMS for whatever reason, but it was actually available through this quest line, and it required a minimum level of 30, which isn't even that insane. You wouldn't even want to train at Florina Beach before level 30. Lorangs and Clangs are easily the most iconic enemies from this area. They were both weak to the lightning element, and with how densely populated they were, plus the somewhat awkward layout of these maps that only teleport could navigate easily, Ice Lightning Wizards were utterly dominant when it came to training at Florina Beach. In fact, even as they reached the 60s, they could move on to Hot Sand. This is a map that contained Clangs and Torties, and though Torties weren't weak to lightning, they were still found alongside the lightning-weak Clangs and had a decent enough HP to EXP ratio. Just like the previous maps that Ice Lightning mages could train at, this map was also densely packed, and during the beta era, Ice Lightning Wizards would find themselves either here or at Red Drakes, who were weak to ice. Though Red Drakes did have more appeal with their drop table containing steelies. The final objective for the difficult quest line, the chaos behind Alphonse Green and the Nepenthe Juice, requires 20 coconuts, which could only be obtained from Florina Beach's coconut trees, which were everywhere. These coconuts weren't particularly useful though, since they were just an etc. item that took up space. After slowly falling off in popularity over time, Hot Sand received a change that once again brought it back into the public eye. When King Klang was added to the game in version 49, this map regained popularity as a map that contained an area boss who had valuable drops. There was even a quest associated with killing King Klang that rewarded fame, so Florina Beach became more popular during this time than it ever had been before, since it now appealed to everyone. I don't have all that many memories associated with Florina Beach, honestly. It wasn't an area that warriors particularly thrived in, and I never spent much time playing Ice Lightning, so I simply never found myself here. Though I do recognize that Lorangs and Klangs were great EXP for that class for a long time. Ice Lightning mains are probably intimately familiar with these areas since they were stuck training here through a massive range of levels. It's that time once again to head away from Victoria Island for a bit and continue our journey to Zacham's Altar, which was located deep in El Nath. Beyond Wolf territory, we find the Forest of Dead Trees. This is a series of maps that contain exclusively zombie enemies. I've talked about these monsters a number of times before. They had great EXP, were found on multiple maps that all had favorable layouts, and they were so popular that they hosted some of the most iconic KS wars in their prime during the mid-2000s in GMS. The first and most obvious question is, what caused these people to become zombies? Why is everything here dead? I'm sure the explanation lies somewhere within the lore, and I'm just not familiar with it, and it probably has something to do with Zachem. But this area definitely gives off the feeling of a place that has always been dangerous, and eventually that danger came to a head, and everyone involved here died. Even when everything here was still alive, I'm sure this place was pretty dangerous. These maps were a part of the El Nath dungeon, which was locked behind a level 50 requirement. When I was young, I remember being fascinated by this area. During the first few years after GMS's release, El Nath was the endgame training spot. Videos from JMS used to show off this region in every video you could possibly find, and with that server's increased base EXP rate back then, plus the fact that it had been out for almost 2 years before GMS was released, players in Japan were super high level compared to the average high level players we had. When El Nath was at its peak popularity, I was nowhere close to level 50. Training on these zombies was something I could only imagine. For many, though, it was their best training spot for months, potentially. The less popular set of maps that contained minor zombies was found right after Forest of Dead Trees. This was still on the direct path to Zachem, but these enemies just weren't as popular. When you look at the difference in map layouts, though, it's pretty obvious why that was the case. The dead mines were much larger and featured a significant amount of verticality to their layout. In the dead mines, it was easy to find 3 levels of platforms that all contained enemies, whereas the Forest of Dead Trees never had more than 2 levels of platforms. This didn't stop it from being a viable training spot, but since there were also fly eyes on these maps, they simply weren't as popular. Minor zombies did offer something of value that normal zombies didn't, however, and this came in the form of mesos. Their regular drops really weren't superior in any way, but minor zombies could also drop Zombies Lost Gold Tooth. These were very valuable items, and they were required to complete the Zachem prequest, which was mandatory completion for any character who wanted to enter Zachem. On top of this, these gold teeth were mandatory for acquiring extra Eyes of Fire. Getting more than the ones given after the initial completion of the prequest required completion of the entire prequest once again, including the requirement for 30 gold teeth. This made them an item that was in constant demand, that exclusively dropped from monsters that nobody wanted to train on. Anyone with experience in MMO economics knows what this means. Unlimited money glitch. As long as one was capable of killing minor zombies, they were able to farm an item that was in high demand with a very low supply. And since the gold teeth were never made available as a drop from any other monster, and the minor zombie maps were never updated to be more favorable within the meta, this dynamic never changed. People always wanted gold teeth, and they always sold for decent money until the economy was ruined during the dark era of MapleStory. Zombie enemies are a major stop on the tour bus to Zachem, probably the most culturally significant one for GMS. It wasn't until the rise of private servers with their increased EXP rates that I personally was finally able to experience training in these areas, and I think we all appreciate how impactful the Forest of Dead Trees was to every old school Mapler's experience with the game, whether they were able to train there or not. For the first time in this series, we're heading to Ludibrium to take a look at another extremely iconic area that I truly believe is underrepresented and mostly forgotten, despite the fact that it still exists in modern GMS. Ludibrium is an area that is propped up by two massive towers on both the west and east side of the city. To the west is Eos Tower, and to the east is Helios Tower. Eos Tower eventually leads down to Omega Sector, and Helios Tower leads down to Korean Folktown. Helios Tower is the smaller of the two, only possessing 3 accessible floors. After version 72, an additional floor was added that led to the map Time Control Room. This was the connecting area between Ellen Forest and Ludibrium. Before that, Helios Tower only connected Ludibrium and Korean Folktown. The 100th floor and the 99th floor were the only accessible upper levels. Floor 99 held an elevator that ran on a 5-minute timer and would travel all the way down to floor 1. Every other floor was simply skipped. Floor 1 held the entrance to the Helios Tower Library, which is a pretty significant area. If you're an avid quester or played Cygnus Nights frequently, you probably found yourself here a lot. And even if you didn't do either of those things, you would still likely find yourself at Helios Tower Library every so often for various pre-quests and such. Helios Tower Library led directly to Korean Folktown, which is an entirely separate discussion of its own, so let's return to Helios Tower itself. Korean Folktown and Helios Tower were closely tied together, as one might expect, and the Retz enemies found throughout the explorable areas of Helios Tower were the connecting link. These monsters were a part of a few different quests in Korean Folktown, but they also served as a great training spot for a number of classes. Specifically, Ice Lightning Wizard's Thunderbolt skill could be used on the 99th floor in these specific spots. This would allow the Ice Lightning to hit every enemy on these platforms while staying completely safe, as long as they used teleport to travel between the two screws. Like most lazy training spots in old school MapleStory, this wasn't amazing EXP, but it was still pretty good. That was the trade-off, of course. You never got hits, you didn't have to put in all that much effort, so you could watch Netflix while you were training, but the rates weren't as good as if you were out there roughing it at the maps that had, admittedly, kind of poor layouts. That's pretty much everything Helios Tower itself had to offer, so let's head over to Eos Tower and become familiar with this massive installation that contained a huge amount of content. Starting off, the 101st floor of Eos Tower was also the entry point for Ludibrium PQ. This is where everyone would congregate back in the day in search of parties. It's an area I'm sure we're all very familiar with. The remaining floors of Eos Tower alternate between taking the player through the tower's interior and bringing them to its exterior. Eos Tower contains a total of 46 floors that the player can explore if we include LPQ's entrance. There are a total of 100 floors that make up the tower, but there are sections of the tower that are grouped together into a single map, such as floors 46 through 55. All of these floors take place on one map, so you don't actually get to explore them individually. One of these combo floors, specifically floors 26 through 40, contain one of my favorite NPCs in the game, Gumball Machine. This potion-selling NPC was so insanely convenient for the players who actually wanted to hang out at Eos Tower to farm at the Drum Bunny mini-dungeon for that super rare and valuable Chaos Scroll drop. Gumball Machine sold everything at a 5% discount, which was nice, and this was one of the few locations where players could purchase bronze arrows. We love Gumball Machine. The exterior portions of Eos Tower were always very grand to me when I was younger. The track that plays on the maps that are located on the exterior of the tower is one of my favorite songs in Old School MapleStory. I actually have it on my stream playlist. I like it that much. It's called High Enough, and it really does make the player feel like they're really high up. Even with the 2D perspective that we have of this game, this song really makes it feel as though you're somewhere really high and it would be maybe a little dangerous if you fell. Throughout the entirety of the tower, you can find these roly-poly NPCs who are a part of the quest Just Another Day at Work. This is a weird quest because it requires traversing the entire tower and talking to every single NPC to receive their photos, but the reward wasn't anything special. No unique items or even decent EXP. I remember this quest vividly because of the fact that the reward for it was so underwhelming. All the way down at floor 8 is a hidden entrance that leads to the map Hidden Tower. This is a map that I am very familiar with as a warrior main. These block golems were large enemies who hit hard, but they were decent EXP for a warrior in their 40s. There was even the Rombot mini-boss who spawned here semi-frequently and had a chance to drop the Serpent's Tongue, which is a level 50 spear. The only real issue with this map is its accessibility. Since the entrance to Hidden Tower was all the way down on floor 8, the player needed to either spend most of their time in Omega Sector or have access to Eos Rock Scrolls. Just like with Orbis Tower, there were 2 daily repeatable quests in Eos Tower that rewarded a huge number of Eos Rock Scrolls. Eos Tower had 4 rocks to teleport between, as opposed to Orbis Tower's 2. This was pretty obviously due to the difference in the size of the towers, and Eos Tower scrolls were less valuable than Orbis Tower scrolls because of how accessible they were. Over time, Eos Tower was shortened and eventually was reduced from its initial 46 down to just 35 traversable maps, which is actually less of a reduction than I would have expected. For some reason, Eos Tower and Ludibrium as a whole have remained completely unchanged, save for the levels of enemies, and Eos Tower is pretty much completely intact from Old School MapleStory. When Ludibrium was first released, I was in middle school, and I remember coming home that day and exploring the entire tower on my very weak, mid-level 20 warrior. Movement speed was very slow, and it probably took me multiple hours to get through, and then I found myself at the bottom of the tower and had to figure out how to get back up. It's really not all that surprising that I never reached a high level if that's the kind of thing I spent my time doing, getting myself stranded at the bottom of Eos Tower. Eos Tower and Helios Tower are 2 areas that I personally feel never received enough attention. They were very important locations, but they were never the focus of Ludibrium. There were too many other locations that were far more interesting, such as the next area we're exploring today. Also located in Ludibrium, this time within the main clock tower, is a map that is only accessible through special means. Breaking one of these boxes located throughout the Toy Factory maps has a chance to teleport the player to the map's secret factory. This is a special map that contains a set number of boxes that can be broken to reveal multiple Toy Trojan enemies. A legendary mob from Old School MapleStory who had a really nice HP to EXP ratio and was rare to find on its own. Toy Trojans were great for mobbing throughout the early to mid-40s, but outside of this secret factory map, there wasn't a single map in the game that they spawned on that wasn't shared by other enemies, minimizing their overall impact as an iconic training mob. If you were playing during this era, you've probably heard of Secret Factory before. As a spearman, training here was highly recommended, since these mobs moved quickly and could be grouped together to take out all at once with Slash Blast. Many guides I've read recommended Secret Factory, but for whatever reason, I never actually grinded there. I was too focused on doing party quests instead, I guess. From my perspective, I can't confirm that EXP rates at Secret Factory were any good, but it was a map that was discussed frequently back in the day, and it's unlikely that every single guide that mentioned it being an efficient training spot was wrong. This map lives in my memory very vividly, despite the small amount of time I've actually spent there. An area that was easily missed by the majority of players is the secret spa located in Showa Town. This is a small hidden map connected to the regular spas that were accessible through Hikari in Showa Town. You'd be sent to the spa after talking to her and could enter the secret spa by going through this hidden portal. Originally, this map looked like this and contained both red slimes and firebomb enemies. This map was only really useful as an extremely niche grinding spot. Since red slimes were never found on any other map, this was also the only place to farm their drops, and they had a couple very unique and useful items in their drop table. The most impactful of these were the fallen leaf earrings that could roll clean with up to +3 magic attack, making them best in slot earrings for any magician. Red slimes could also drop the Cao Cao bow, the Mr. Rasfelt gun, as well as 30% two-handed blunt weapon attack scrolls, which now that I'm saying this out loud, I realize is not that amazing. Regardless, the fallen leaf earrings were enough to throw the secret spa into relevance in GMS, and everything else was just a bonus. The secret spa still exists in modern GMS, but in version 2.21 it was completely redesigned. This was the Spring Blossom update, which brought a revamp of Showa Town and Zipengu, and this map was silently updated alongside this. The firebombs were removed, and the red slimes were reskinned to become silver slimes. They possessed the same stats and probably have the same drop table, but I haven't personally spent very much time grinding here to see what they drop. This new layout of the secret spa and its new assets make the map feel a lot less sinister, and I really like this area even more than I did in its first iteration. I'm sure that if we looked around Zipengu, we'd find even more subtle changes like this, but we'll have to save that for some other time. As I start to head towards covering more post-Big Bang content, it's about time we discuss a map that was released in version 107 after Big Bang during the Alliance update. This area is one of the more iconic locations in the minds of GMS players, I would imagine, and there's good reason for that. These aliens had an insane HP to EXP ratio. This was after Big Bang, so we had already begun the slow process of shifting over to quantity over quality when it comes to mobbing, and these guys were a major player in that transition. Every class could train here without issue, and if I'm not mistaken, these aliens were a viable training option from the early 90s all the way to 4th job at level 120. I wasn't playing MapleStory very much during the time that this map was at its peak in the meta, but I have plenty of memories training here on various characters as I attempted to get back into the game. I'm pretty sure my Shadower in Elysium grinded here in the past. This area, from what I understand, was non-KMS content that naturally was very overpowered. Masteria's legacy, at least in my mind, is that it consistently brought overpowered content to us in GMS while attempting to tell a compelling story that remains unfinished and unpolished. For better or worse, this is part of our version's history. This alien base content came as an overhaul to New Leaf City, and it was introduced in the same update that Nebulites were released. As it turns out, Nebulites are pretty old. They were released closer to the launch of GMS than to modern GMS, even as of making this video. Alien Base Corridor pervaded throughout GMS as a meta training spot for a few years, but by the time the Starforce system was released in version 157, they had started to fall off. Eventually, NLC was redesigned once more, and Alien Base Corridor was completely removed from the game in version 206. It was completely taken out of the files. It's now gone, probably forever as far as official servers are concerned, but for anyone who played GMS during the early 2010s, this is an area we won't likely forget anytime soon. Hey, thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube for their continued support. In the big tier, we have Jerry L, Anonymous, Jacob, Mushba, Sock Ears, Rafe Rum, Swirled, and DJ Sammy. If you want to support me, one of the best ways to do so is through Patreon or YouTube membership. You'll get a special role in my Discord server, access to my video schedule, monthly updates, and my future plans, as well as my eternal thanks for allowing me to do what I love.